Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Crop Hour. My name is Patrick Wagner. I'll be your host today. Um, Welcome to Insect Week. A little about myself, I guess I'm the entomology field specialist based out of Rapid City. So we're going to be talking about entomology, all things insects here this week. Today we're going to be starting off with soybeans. I'll introduce our speakers here in a little bit, but first I wanted to just let everybody know that if you have any questions during the course of the presentations, you can put those into the Q&A section. And then for CCA credits, those are available, but at cost. So that's $30 per week and then $200 for the entire series. So we'll start. Our first speaker is Dr. Adam Varenhorst. He's an associate professor and extension field crop entomologist. He's going to be talking about Dectes stem borer, mostly kind of a research update there. And then our second speaker will be Phil Rozeboom, and he's our IPM coordinator. But Adam, I can see your slides are there, so I think I'll just go ahead and turn it over to you.
All right. Well, good morning and thanks, Pat. I'm going to start today off with talking about Dectes stem borer and going through some of our research updates from the last few years. And we are still working on this insect pest, so there will be more insect updates to come in the future. So if you're not familiar with it, the Dectes stem borer is a gray beetle, and as you can see in that top picture on the right side of the screen, they have very long antennae, and that's one of the big characteristics that we use for identifying these insects. In soybean, there are quite a few great insects that can be present during the growing season, and some of those are blister beetles, and they will feed on plants a little bit, but the big issue are these Dectes stem borer. The adults are about 5/8 of an inch long, and the larvae, although we don't typically see them because they're actually down in the stem, can vary between 1/3 of an inch to a half inch long. They have a cream colored body with a little bit darker colored head, and one of the key characteristics for them is if you do split a stem and see the larvae present, they'll have an accordion shaped body. And we just say that because, as you can see in the lower picture, each segment has kind of a constricted area between the next one. And so we always say that looks like an accordion. Now, the Dectes stem borer are native to North America, but here's where it gets kind of interesting. They weren't always an issue for soybean production. The Dectes stem borer was first reported as a pest in soybean in 1968. It's believed it started doing a host transition sometime probably a little bit before that, but the first reports of it really being observed in soybean were in 1967. And so we had soybean production occurring in the United States for quite a few years before this pest showed up in soybean. And we don't have a great explanation for why that really happened, other than sunflower production in a lot of states started to decrease and soybean production increased in those same areas. And one of the things we've learned over time is Dectes stem borers aren't very strong flyers for the most part when we observe them in the field. And the other thing is it's believed they're possibly just kind of lazy. And so they took advantage of a host that was abundant and soybean happened to work out for them. And so they just stuck around in soybean. Here in South Dakota, we do have a lot of Dectes stem borer issues in sunflower, but most of that occurs in the central and western part of the state where our sunflower production is at much higher levels than the rest of the state. And then also it's an issue in southern states of the US. Now, the adults may be observed in soybean from June to August, but there is a lot of seasonal variability associated with that. As you can imagine, here in South Dakota, our springs aren't always cut and dried. Sometimes we have snow on the ground later than normal, and sometimes it warms up a little bit earlier than we may have expected it to. And all of that results in having quite a bit of variability. But we do know from our research that typically, sometime from mid to late June through July, you can find the adults out in soybean fields with a sweep net. And then the question is, though, is how long are they active? And most of the time they're active through August, which that makes our management a little bit more difficult, which we will talk about. Now, something else to consider is the Dectes stem borer have alternative hosts, which include common ragweed, giant ragweed, cocklebur, and then sunflower. Now, there is quite a bit of research that's been done to show that the wild sunflower or our weedy sunflower hosts aren't as great of a source of nutrition and survivability for the Dectes stem borer. So, most of the time, we consider the cocklebur and ragweeds as being more of the alternative host for this pest. And so this is a figure pulled from a 2010 paper where a survey was done among entomologists across the United States to see where the Dectes stem borer was an issue. And if we look here in South Dakota, we got a 3 for soybean, which means it's an occasional pest and it was a pest in sunflowers. And that was kind of the history since the 1960s. In South Dakota, Dectes stem borer just weren't a big issue for us in soybean production. And if we look down to the south of us, where they did show up as being more of an issue in soybean, we're quite a bit further south in South Dakota. And that may change, and we know things do change with insects, and maybe that's why we're seeing what's going on right now in our state. Now, for the life cycle for the Dectes stem borer, the adults emerge after pupation, so that happens in the spring in the soybean stubble, and then they start to seek out the next host. They're looking for where they're going to find their mate and where they're going to lay eggs. After mating, the females lay eggs in the leaf petioles, typically in the upper canopy, and as a result of that, they have to chew a little bit so that they can lay the egg in there. And a lot of times those petioles will start to wilt and tip down. And so that can be some of our earliest indication of an infestation occurring. The larvae will hatch in that petiole and begin to tunnel into the main stem. Once they're into the main stem, they're going to start moving up and down, feeding on the pith. Kind of the goal of this insect, though, throughout the entire season is they're trying to move to the soil surface. And that's because that's where they're going to overwinter. And as the plant starts to dry down, they're going to start to excavate an area down towards the base of the plant, typically at or just a little below the soil surface. And then the last thing they do right before they get ready to overwinter is they go up a little bit above where they made their overwintering chamber and they'll cut or girdle the stem. And so they do that from the inside, but they just keep chewing in a circle around the stem. And a lot of times will look like a saw blade. It's very impressive what they can do, but that allows the stem to tip over and that helps them so that the next spring, when it's time to emerge as adults, they don't have to chew out of a stem as an adult. Everything's ready for them to go. And they have one generation here in the state. Gets more complicated if we do have an issue with the Dectes stem borer and soybean because our management recommendations for this pest, the first one you'll see here is do not use foliar insecticides. Research was done somewhere in the ballpark of 20 to 30 years ago that showed that there just wasn't much of an economic return for using foliar insecticides. And one of the big reasons for that was because of that long emergence window we talked about. We can't target a population that really knocks most of them down, is what the research showed. And as a result, we just don't see a great knockdown. We don't see a great return on our investment. Tillage is talked about quite a bit, but in South Dakota here, we do have a lot of acres being converted to no-till. And in that research, the tillage had a limited effect on the Dectes stem borer. The idea was that you were just disrupting the overwintering habitat enough that some froze and some got buried too deep. But it wasn't a silver bullet, so to speak. One of the big things is the management of weedy hosts, especially the ragweed and the cocklebur species. However, in most fields in South Dakota, we do have a lot of weed management occurring. And, one of the probably biggest things that changed this for us was the advent of glyphosate, so Roundup, because I can remember years ago, quite a few years ago, before we had Roundup, cockleburs were a major issue in a lot of soybean fields. And once Roundup came around, it seemed like they weren't quite as bad. Crop rotation is another management option. However, we do rotate our crops. And as we look more and more at crop rotation as an option, we get into the mess of we can't ask our neighbors to all get on the same rotation as us. And so as a result, a lot of times we have neighborhood effects and we still get the pest populations because maybe we're just on an opposite rotation from our neighbors. And then the last thing, which doesn't work great, if you've ever tried to harvest soybeans before they're ready, is early harvest of infested fields. And so that is the idea there, is to try to catch those before they start to tip over and lodge due to that girdling activity by the larva. And so the big economic impact from this pest is the larva tunneling can reduce yields by about 10 to 15%, which depending on the year, you may really notice it or you may not notice it. The other thing that these do, as I mentioned, is they cause the plants to tip over, and that can be a major issue. Now, it's from previous research, it's estimated that about 17% of plants that are infested will lodge. That's under normal weather conditions. Now, if we have kind of some strong storms or strong winds, which are always possible here in South Dakota, there's a great chance to increase that lodging, as shown in this picture here. And as a result, it's very difficult to harvest those beans when they fully tip over and lodge. And here in this picture on the left here is actually what that girdling. So I mentioned it looks almost like a saw blade. The larva is actually down right here. He's in the center and he made a little plug so he won't get too cold. But what we always notice on these cut plants is there's a strip of the epidermis or the soybean skin still present. And we believe the reason for that is they don't want it to tip over too soon. And they want to try to keep that stem there as long as possible for that little bit of extra insulation. And though they do want it to tip over, so they don't want it to fall over immediately. And that's why that's left. Now, in South Dakota, we have been having increased issues with the Dectes stem borer. So that's why we're talking about it today. Since 2017, we've been having increased reports of field infestations of this pest. The thing that's concerning is for the last few years, when we go out to the fields that are reported, a lot of them we're seeing infestations that are more than 80% of the scouted plants have a Dectes stem borer larva in them. And really, the easiest time to go out and scout to see whether or not your field was affected by this pest is at harvest. Because from what we found is you can walk along and look at the stubble and with very high accuracy determine whether or not there's a frass plug, because if there isn't, you should be able to see down into the stubble. There should be a little hole where the pith dried out. But where the Dectes stem borer are present, you end up with a nice little plug and it looks like it's perfectly smooth. Now, originally, our infested fields were primarily in the Yankton and Bonhomme counties. However, we've had additional counties getting added to that list over the last few years. And the other thing is that it seems like every year we hear of more infested fields. So what do we do? I went through the list already of, the management recommendations, and it looks kind of bleak. And so that's why this research came up, because we can't really rely on crop rotations because they're already existing in South Dakota. We're not planting bean on bean fields. Many fields are being transitioned to no-till, and we don't want to rotate those out because no-till has its own benefits. We already are doing our best to manage weedy hosts, and so what do we do? And so one of the things I wanted to look at, because it had been quite a few years, is let's look at the foliar insecticide. Let's see if maybe there's a product that's newer. Maybe there's something that's changed. Maybe it's something that we can target with a timing of the applications. And then the second part of the research that we did was trying to identify where these Dectes stem borer are the worst in South Dakota. And so we planted our plots out in the fields. We went to farmer fields with a recent history of having Dectes stem borer infestations. And so we planted, we managed when we started to see the Dectes stem borer, and then at the end of the season, we went out and we pulled a lot of soybean stems, threw them in garbage bags, and brought them back to the lab to split them because we were looking to see how many had the larvae present. I'm not going to show that data, but it essentially lines up with our yield data, because the fewer larvae we had, the higher the yields were. And so I'm just going to show the 2024 data for day to keep things a little bit shorter. But we had 2 locations, one near Tabor and one near Minnow. And at these, we had 4 treatments. The treatments were for the insecticides are labeled for Dectes stem borer management in soybean here in the state. And we had 8 blocks. So essentially, we repeated each treatment 8 times. And here's where we went in and we sprayed on the July 8th time point. Now in 2024, we wanted to spray a little bit earlier, but the fields were too wet. And so then we came back a couple weeks later on the 25th and sprayed. And then we also had plots that got sprayed during both times just to see if maybe, because there's that long emergence period, maybe we needed to have two treatments. Now, the reason I said we wanted to try to get in a little before July 8th is we were going down and scouting these fields, and what triggered the first application was the detection of the Dectes stem borer adults out in the field. And so everything in the farmer fields was uh, done by commercial standards because we let the farmers choose the seed. We let them uh, use their herbicides, whatever they wanted to do. The only thing is we managed the insecticides. And our plots were 10 feet, so 4 rows wide by 25 feet long. And so each week we'd go out and monitor the untreated plots for the Dectes stem borer just to make sure we still had populations. And as I mentioned prior to harvest, we went down and collected 20 stems. We had a lot of stems, a lot of trips to get all of that. And we, at the end of the season, collected yield with our small plot combine. So here are our 4 insecticide treatments that are labeled for Dectes stem borer. The first is Alavist. That is a combination of bifenthrin and chlorantraniliprole. The next is Hero, which is a combination of zeta-zypermethrin and bifenthrin. Brigade 2EC, which is just bifenthrin, and then Vantacor, which is just chlorantraniliprole. And before we get started, I do want to mention that the chlorantraniliprole, so in Vantacor and Alavist, is a newer chemistry, and it's a little bit more expensive per acre. And that's going to come in when we're talking about some of the economics. And so here's a graph from our minnow location. And just to walk you through first, we have our treatments over here. So if you look, there's the treatment name and then late, combo, or early, just to indicate when those were sprayed. The dark gray bars represent all of the later treatments, the lighter bars, all of the early treatments, and the ones with the lines inside the bar represent the combination treatments. And down here is our yield in bushels per acre. And so for this analysis, what we were doing is we were comparing each individual treatment to the untreated control. And what we wanted to see is something that stood out as being statistically significant in terms of difference between the untreated control. And for our minnow location, the only treatment that was significantly different was the Hero applied late. So that was that late July application. And we were excited just to see that something looked like it really stood out. And we saw some other trends numerically where there were some increases. But as you can see here, we are looking at maybe 32 bushels, 33, 34 for the untreated, and maybe 36. So not a huge increase. But when we looked at our Tabor location, which had a little bit more pressure from the Dectes stem borer in 2024, we saw we had more treatments stand out. So same setup. So our Hero late, our Vantacor combo, Elevus combo, and Hero combo. So those are the ones applied at 2 time points. The one was just at the later time in July. They all stood out as being significantly different from our untreated control. Now, you'll notice also the Tabor yielded a little bit better than the minnow location in 2024, probably just due to moisture availability. It seemed like the rains were kind of hit or miss that year. But we see we're about at 49 bushels per acre, and then we got up to about 56, 57 on our late application of Hero. And how does that all break out? Well, I did my best with a pencil and paper to kind of figure out some of those economics. But the takeaway is that there were treatments in 2024 that outperformed the untreated. And the ones that really stood out was at both locations, the Hero applied during that later part of July. And then the Elevus, Hero, and Vantacor combo treatments at the Tabor location all stood out as having a little bit better results. And when we did compare the other so we compared insecticides to one another and at the different time points, these same treatments outperformed their counterparts. So it wasn't just that the untreated was really low, they actually did have some benefit to. And so here's the economics. So we had a 9.1 bushel per acre benefit for the Hero applied late. And this is a little bit outdated, but just to keep the math so it all was the same, I left it from when I wrote the paper on this. And so the estimated soybean price was $10.15 per bushel. The estimated application plus insecticide cost for the Hero was about $25.48. And so we were looking at somewhere in the ballpark of $66, almost $67 per acre yield benefit compared to not using any treatment at all. And that would be true about 95% of the time. And one of the things I noted down here is we didn't have excessive lodging. So in 2024, we didn't have weather events that increased the lodging. And so what's important to note is that if we would have, the yield benefit may have been much higher because by not having the infestations and not having the potential for lodging, we may have had even better results. Now, if we look at the Vanticore, because it also stood out, and I had to do a cutoff, they had to have positive profit. So, terms of return on investment. So you can imagine if I'm not listing all of the treatments, the other ones weren't positive. But for the Vanticore combo treatment, we had a 7.8 bushel per acre benefit, same soybean price. Now, here's what I mentioned the Vanticore is a little bit more expensive up front for the insecticide. So the estimated application plus insecticide was $76.60 per acre. And so if you use the Vanacore, you're looking at a $2.57 per acre yield benefit. And you can imagine I had the same thought is that doesn't look as nice as that Hero because the Hero is going to give you a little bit more return. And then I got to thinking, what if we actually have to do both time points? Because the Hero in one year, the Hero applied later in the season worked really well. But what if you have a really large infestation? You catch it early. And one of the things we talk about a lot is we don't want people to apply the same insecticide more than once per season because as we've talked about over and over during the past years is that that's how you get insecticide resistance. And so taking our two most profitable treatments, if we did a Vanticore early and then still kept that Hero later, we'd be looking at about that 9.1 bushel per acre benefit going off of what the Hero alone looked like. And looking at everything, our cost would be about $63.78 per acre, and we'd be looking at $28.59 per acre yield benefit. So, uh, not as good as the Hero by itself, but that's kind of your worst case scenario if you thought you needed two treatments, and it's still better than if you were to use the Vanticore twice. So, the takeaway here is that we can get some yield benefits. And if we look back on the in the past, one of the things that we saw, and I believe it was one other study saw, is that correct application timing is really key for Dectes stem borer management. If you just go out and spray at one time point, uh, chances are, if you didn't spray at the right time, so the adults weren't completely active, or maybe you caught them really early, you probably won't see a yield benefit. Peak emergence, we know occurs sometime in July, but with saying peak emergence, it still doesn't mean that it's all at once. They have a very prolonged emergence window. So we believe the key here is trying to spray those soybeans when they are going to have the most cumulative Dectes pressure, which for 2024 was later in July. And spraying should still be triggered by the observation of adults, but one of the things are trying to look at here going into 2026 is looking at degree days. And so if the benefit of the degree day modeling would be that we could go out there and look at when the numbers hit the right temperature regime for the Dectes stem borer, we go out and determine whether or not adults are active or not. And then we can determine when the highest infestations are going to be. We don't have that ready to go yet, but we're hoping that we can get that resolved and figured out and have that ready for everyone in 2027. So the last part I'll go through quickly is we did do the survey. So we went out through soybean fields. These were farmer fields. We'd go out, swing a sweep net a few times, and see whether or not there were the Dectes stem borer adults present. And so in 2023, we sampled 35 counties. 2024, we did 25 counties, but we increased the number of fields per county. And we are going out there from early to mid-June, then the 2024, late June to mid-July. In 2023, it seemed like we were finding somewhat isolated small populations, but we believe maybe we were just a little too gung-ho and we got out into the field too early. Because if we compare the 2023 to 2024, we are seeing 0 to 3 adults per field, and the ones where we detected them in 2023 and in 2024, just by moving our sampling back a little bit, we are seeing populations as large as 20 to 43 adults per field. And so that's a lot of Dectes stem borer adults. We have to use a sweep net because you can't just go out and catch these with your hands. They do have a defense where if they see you or the plant gets shaded, a lot of times they'll hide. And so sweep nets are the most effective way. But what we found is that it does still seem to be down in the southeast part of the state where the highest infestations are. So still somewhat where they originally reported, but it does seem like we're getting some eastward movement. And then if we look up here, this is what really shocked us. My student, Zach Loomis, who was doing this research, wanted to still survey as many counties as possible, even with the increased effort down in the southeast part of the state. And we did detect the Dectes up in counties where they haven't been reported in soybeans. So the takeaway there is that we really need to monitor probably all of our soybean fields for this pest because they are in our soybean. And one of the things we notice is once they start increasing, it seems like they stick around pretty well. We still don't know how far they can fly, so that's kind of a hindrance for us. But looking at the data from close relatives, it's probably not real long distances each season. And so there is a potential, though, for a lot of soybeans to be infested here in South Dakota. And so the key thing I want you all to consider is next spring, as we get into the season here in 2026, is uh, go out and scout your soybeans and use a sweep net and see if you catch any of these gray beetles with a really long antenna. So with that, I'd like to thank our funding sources, which were South Dakota Soybean Checkoff and then NCSRP. And I have a few slides for your information. And if you need to get a hold of me or if you have further questions, please feel free. You can come meet me in my office. Otherwise, you can always reach me at my phone number here or send me an email. So with that, I'll turn things back over, Pat. Thanks a lot.
All right, thanks, Adam. So just looking at the Q&A, I'm not seeing any questions coming in yet. Anybody, if you have any questions at all, yeah, there's that button there on the bottom for the Q&A, and feel free to ask those. Oh, looks like one just popped up here. So, Adam, do you want to address that now, or do you want to take it at the end?
I will go ahead and address it right now.
Sure. So question, what would be the best application method or equipment for spraying Dectes stem borer?
That's a great question. Uh, what we've been using is just your kind of your typical foliar application. We do have the advantage that we have small plot equipment, so our booms are a little bit lower than commercial equipment would be. But ideally, you run the boom as low as you need to for the soybean, and we're just doing a pretty standard application, so nothing fancy in terms of the rate. We're just going off of the high rate on the insecticide, and we've seen good results. The biggest thing though I do think is that it's that timing. So being out there probably mid July to late July from our data is when we know we need to be out there. The early maybe we're catching a few really early uh, infesting dectes, but uh, ground rigs should do fine.
Sounds good. And if you have any other questions, again, yeah, feel free to use that Q&A feature and we'll get to them here at the end. So we'll move on to our next speaker. This is Phil Rozeboom, and as mentioned previously, he's our IPM coordinator located in Brookings on campus. And Phil's going to be talking to us about soybean gall midge and several other soybean pests. So, Phil, you got about 30 minutes and go for it.
All right, thank you, Pat. As Pat said, I am, the SDSU Extension IPM Coordinator, and this talk is also, Dr. Varenhorst and Pat, they're also a part of it. But so besides the Dectes, unfortunately, there are other pests in our soybean fields, and southeast South Dakota seems to be the one that gets picked on the most. Soybean Gall Midge, that part of the state a lot. Soybean aphid, we'll cover that a little bit. A new pest, deformed leaf miner, at least for soy in South Dakota, and cover some defoliators, some gentle defoliators. So with that, we'll start with Gall Midge, if it'll advance for me. There we go. All right, so if you guys are have been attending, our talks in person and at the crop bar, we have covered soybean gall midge before, but it is a pest that we want you to be aware. So here is two pictures of the soybean gall midge, the in particular. The picture on the left, that's what you'll see most often. That's the third instar of the gall midge. They're that fire red orange. And then on the left, you can see a earlier instar of soybean gall midge, and then this good picture of the damage, the discoloration that they cause to the epidermis of your soybean. So here's a better picture of those three instars. That first instar is when, where they first appear, very tiny, very hard to see. The second instar, they start gaining fire red orange coloration. And then that third instar, as you can see, is that coloration. And then again, in the background, you can see that stem, that dark brown discoloration caused by that gall midge. So just for reference, this is the adult of the soybean gulch. They're very tiny, kind of the larva, about a quarter of an inch, from leg tip to leg. They have orange abdomens. You probably won't be able to see very well because they're underneath wings there. A good indication that it is a gulmet. If you ever see something like this, it is that white and black banded legs as seen there. And then of course they have a pair of wings. We can show this for reference, but in person, I've only one adult, and we've been seeing this insect for probably almost a decade at this point. But just for instance, if you do see it. Here's an example. I believe this was done. This was a soybean that we pulled of a field in southeast South Dakota. And this is a very severe example of a heavy infestation. So you can see that's the third instar soybean gall midge larva along with there's other second instar seen there. But this is a very severe example. And again, you can see that dark discoloration of that soybean stem. That's the clear indication that you have soybean gall midge is that discoloration at the base of that soybean stem. So here's what's like early in the season. One thing to keep in mind is finch. They do not fly very far or at all. They're kind of like aphids. They get blown in the wind. So infestations, from what found, they always start at the edge of your soybean field. You can see in this picture, corn field is up at top of that picture. That was sown last year. So they'll overwinter that soil from where they infect, and then they'll move into, the closest soybean field. So they start at the edge move further in. So here's a zoomed out picture I believe was taken in Nebraska a few years ago. You can see the cornfield and then that discoloration, dead and dying soybean plants. That is caused by that soybean gall midge. And they started in last year's soybean, so corn, crop rotation, corn, soybean, corn, soybean. They started in last year's soybean field and then flew into this year's soybean field. They always start at the edge and they kind of work their way into that soybean field. So here's kind of a zoomed in picture of that discoloration. As you can see, it's way at the bottom near the soil surface. Soybean naturally has that scarring as they grow on that skin, the epidermis will split. But if you look around that, you see that dark brown discoloration. That is caused by that gall midge, and that's what we encourage you to look for if you think you have that. Another characteristic of a soybean gall midge infestation is those stems become very brittle, almost like, a dried tree twig. It's very easy to snap. It doesn't take a lot of effort to snap them over. So here's the picture on the right. This is when we were scouting for soybean gall midge when they hit real hard in southeast South Dakota. We were looking for them. And just walking down the row of soybean field, the plants would snap over. That's how brittle they were. That is a good indication that you have a soybean gall midge infestation in your field. So if you think you have gall midge, things to look for, with insects, you always have to go out in the field, have to scout to know what you have. Wilting plants, it looked just like that picture I showed earlier, right next to the corn. Those discolored stems, that's a very good giveaway. stem swelling. This it's I wouldn't look for that really because the stem swelling, from what I found, is quite small. Look for that discoloration instead. And then, of course, those dead plants in the edge of your field. That's a very good, that's what we look for. If we see wilting, dead, dying plants on the edge of the field, that's a good indication that you have gall midge. There are diseases and things that could look like that as well. That's why it's important to get out and look at those soybean plants to really know what it is. So why should we care? When the soybean gall midge was real heavy, I believe in 2019. This is a yield heat map of soybean gall midge infestation. Field edges, you had 10 to 100% yield loss. So that picture I showed from Nebraska right next to the cornfield, that was 100% yield loss, within the first 5 feet of that field there. And that results or can result in a 10 to 50% yield reduction for that entire field. And that's a lot of field loss, a lot of money lost to that gall midge. So since 2018, we have been conducting surveys looking for the distribution of gall midge because, like with any pest, you have to know where it is and where to look for it. So 2018, that dark or red color, that is where we found the counties there. And you can see it includes Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota there, um, all the way to 2025. And we did find gall midge in 2024. We did not find any more in any new counties in 2025, but you can see other states have uh, over time. One thing I will say about this map, though, is Edmonds County there, it is red. We did in 2018, but keep in mind that could have been one gall midge in one field. We driven through that county for 8 and find one gall, one soybean plant. That's still confirmation that it's there. However, in counties like Clay, Union, Lincoln, Yankton, Bon Homme, formation would be hundreds of midge in one plant, and then you next plant and it's another 100. So this is just its distribution. It does not mean its density. For the most part, Southeast South Dakota is where gall midge seems to hit the hardest in South Dakota. So a lot with a lot of pests, we monitor. We want to know their distribution, their biology, and to do that for midge, we put out emergence kits. Um, Placed on here's bean stubble, and they're weekly for gall midge adults. The reason for this is we want to know when gall midge emerge. And knowing when they emerge allows us to make management decisions. Kind of like with what Adam said with the Dectes stem borer, knowing their peak emergence allows us to hopefully, pick a management tactic that hits them the hardest. So with this emergence, these emergence cages, it's kind of a blurry picture, but the takeaway is soybeangallmidge.org at the bottom of that picture there. Um, they put out update the information, and this is from 2021, but it still goes now, uh, to allow anyone to know when gall midge is emerging and where. So, as I mentioned, with insect or just pest management in general, knowing its biology is very important to make proper informed management decisions. So I've kind of touched on this already. They overwinter in a cornfield, and then they will emerge as adults. And here's emergence based on those emergence cages. In 2019, it's June 14th. In 2020, it was June 10th. In 2021, they were a little later. Uh, sorry, a little earlier, May 31st. And you can see that map there. And then with gall midge, kind of like with Dectes, they have a relatively long emergence period. So one management tactic we thought we could do is trying to treat those adults. Um, but with that very long emergence time, that's not really possible. You'd have to get your timing just right, and that can be difficult. So duration of emergence in 2019, it was approximately 15 days. In 2020, it was 25 days. In 2021, it was 36 days. So very long emergence time. And because of that, as I mentioned, that makes it hard to manage them with that long emergence. However, Justin McMecken, he has been doing some pretty thorough research on the gall midge in Nebraska. There are two management tactics that he found that has a significant effect on soybean gall midge. The first one being your ridge tillage or healing. So you can kind of see the pictures here. In the bottom left is an example of them doing that ridge tillage. And what that does is it pushes soil up against that stem and it prevents those gall midge getting into that stem, those adults getting to that soybean stem. You can see that in the bottom right picture, just above Justin's name there. And as you can see on the graph here, no healing is the yellow, and then the blue is healing or that ridge tillage. And the key takeaway is that percent infested on the far right of that graph. As you can see, there is a pretty significant difference between no healing and healing. So if you do have a severe infestation, this might be something you might want to try. The problem is with this, you have to go very slowly, about 3 miles an hour, so it could take a very long time to do. But a good thing is, since gall midge always seem to start at the edge of your soybean field, try this if you do have a heavy infestation or think you might. Try it just on the edge of your field, just one pass, and that could, be the difference between a severe infestation or not. Another management tactic that Justin looked at was a granular T-band or drop nozzle. And if you look at that graph on the far right, you can see here that the drop nozzle he applied leverage 360 was significantly different from your untreated and your overhead, your broadcast spray. The reason the foliar spray or broadcast, above that foliage doesn't seem to work is because those skull midge larvae, they're down in the stem of that soybean and your pesticide just doesn't get to them. So that's what that drop nozzle is for. It sprays directly at the base of that stem, and has a much better chance of providing control against those gall midge. One thing we do want you to keep in mind, though, there are some mis-IDs. This is a picture from Bruce Potter. It's a white mold gall midge. If you do see this and there is white mold, there is a good chance that it is white mold gall midge and not your soybean gall midge. But keep in mind you have to have the presence of white mold for that. All right, our next soybean pest, and I'm sure all of you are quite familiar with this one, they've been around since about 2000, is your soybean aphid. And as I'm sure you guys are well aware, they're found on the underside of leaves in the most part, and then also on your soybean stems. The reason we keep mentioning them is they do occasionally exceed threshold, and they have in some areas during both 24 and 25. So the question is, with all of our insects, really, is will they be a problem in 2026? Well, we really don't know that for sure. Soybean aphids, they kind of, they have hot spots here and there, and they can show up quickly and exceed thresholds quickly. So that's why with all insects and aphids, we highly recommend that you go out to your field and you scout, right? You go and look for what issues you may have. So just scouting recommendations, look at 20 plants at 4 to 5 locations in the field, either walk in, a zigzag pattern or W pattern, and then look for aphids and determine if there are more than 250. When 80% of those 20 plants have 250 aphids or more on them, that's your economic threshold. That's when you want to think about chemical management. However, if you don't want to count that many aphids and that many plants, there is an alternative. So I do have a QR code up on the screen. So take out your phone, open up your camera, point it at that QR code, and a link should appear. That or just take a picture of it now. There is the website towards the top of the screen there as well. But what this is, Iowa State developed a speed scouting for soybean aphid. You can see the directions there. Basically, you if there are less than 40 aphids on entire plant, you mark it minus for that non-infested plant. And I won't go through all of it, but basically what this does is it allows you to scout quickly and still come to, the threshold or not. So I'll give you a little bit more time, either scan or take a picture of that QR code, because this is a very helpful speed scouting for soybean aphids. It cuts a lot of time, and you still get to make, the correct management decision based on threshold. All right, I'll move on from there. So as I mentioned, economic threshold is 250 aphids per plant. If you reach that, that's when you want to start thinking about chemical management, or you have to in order to, avoid yield loss. The economic injury level is 674. That's when you do incur a yield loss. When they reach 674 aphids per plant, that is when you will lose money based on those infestations. And then another part we like to mention is thresholds are valid until R6. So when pods are on, one of the top four nodes has green seeds that fill the pod. The reason we mention this is we will usually get calls later on in the season when we're past R6. Guys will have, 2,000 aphids on their plant. That doesn't matter. After R6, you will not incur a yield loss based on any type of abundance on your soybeans. So if you do spray, you're not really saving any money. You're losing money spraying. Keep that in mind. R6 of your soybean plant. Another thing to keep in mind with soybean aphids is we have confirmed resistance to pyrethroids, and that study was done in 2018. You can see being buggy there that we did for our field trials, but here's our counties that we sampled and looked at, soybean aphids to confirm if they were resistant. We did a small greenhouse study. Well, actually, it was quite large, but a greenhouse study where we confirmed that they are resistant to pyrethroids. And I'm sure you all are aware of that at this point. So management recommendations, do not use a pyrethroid class product because they are resistant to it. Avoid your prophylactic applications. What that means is applying before that threshold. Over the years, spraying pyrethroid over and over and over again and applying it before you reach that threshold, that's how, they became resistant to those pyrethroids. And then this is very important, not just for insecticides, but every disease and weed and just pests in general. Don't use the same insecticide class more than twice. Try to rotate your mode of action. That'll help a lot for insects to not develop resistance to our pesticides. All right, the next insect, and this one is pretty new, as you will see. Just keeping an eye on it, monitoring for this insect in South Dakota. They are native and widespread in eastern North America. They have two native hosts that we know of now, the American hog peanut and the slick seed fuzzy bean. You can see the two pictures taken by Dr. Coach there. And for the most part, they receive very little attention prior to detection in soybean. So they are native, kind of like Dectes in South Dakota as well. They've always been a minor pest until recently they started picking up in their severity. And this is an insect that may do the same. We'll just keep an eye on it. So here's a picture of the adult. Just like the gall midge, they are extremely tiny, about 1/4 of an inch. They're very colorful though. Front wings, orange, white, gray, black markings. And as you can see here in this picture, here's a quarter with a adult tentiform leaf miner on it. So just very tiny. So here's damage you can look for earlier on in the season and then later on in the season as well. But first thing you can look for is the egg. And as you can see, they are very tiny and pretty hard to see. If I saw this out in the field, I don't think I would immediately, call that a tentiform leaf miner because you can have thrips or something like that that look similar on leaves. But as after the eggs they hatch, and then you have your second and third larval instar. And their early damage caused by those instars are serpentine in nature. So if you look at the picture just above the text there, you can see that serpentine pattern. The next stage, the third instar of your larva produce a blotch. You can see just above that, you can see the very tiny larva there underneath that blotch. And your fourth and fifth larval instars and your pupa produce that tentiform structure. So that upper left or upper surface picture is seen there. You see those little dots basically in that tentiform structure. That is produced by those fourth, fifth larvae, and that's where this pest gets that name. The lower surface, you can see they get in between the epidermis of that soybean leaf. So you see they cause that damage and all those dots on the upper surface. And then there's on the surface, you can see the fifth instarva there, along with the epidermis damage, and then there's that pupa as well on the right. Two pupa actually. So first detection, first detection, keep in mind this is native. It went after different hosts, and then it decided it liked to go after soybean. The first detection of tentiform leaf miner soybean was in Quebec, Canada in 2016. Of course, the alert goes out, all the entomologists start looking for it. They confirmed it in 2019 and 2021 in Quebec as well. And then in Minnesota in 2021, Robert found it near St. Paul and Rosemount. And then you can see the pretty severe damage there on those two pictures. So country level first detect or county level first detection in U.S. soybean. It starts in 2021. You can see there near the St. Paul, Rosemont regions there in the light green. In 2022, Robert did find it in South Dakota. You can see there. In 2023, it was found all over Minnesota and parts of North Dakota with that light pink color. And then in 2024, orange, and 2025, blue. You can see it spread even further, reaching Missouri, Nebraska, Iowa, and parts of North Dakota. In 2025, we did look for leaf miner. We did do a survey at our research farm and our cooperators, our producers that we work with. We did not find it, but I'm sure that's something that we will continue to monitor for this year and the year after that to keep an eye on it. Because as I mentioned, it is a relatively newer pest for soybean. So Robert, just like with your soybean gall midge and your Dectes, we're trying to figure out the biology of the insect because knowing how it infests, when it infests, that helps us make management decisions. So what this graph and this picture here is he wanted to know, how it infested fields. So that picture on the right, those eight yellow lines, there's four right on the field edge next to the road, and then there's four next to a shelter, trees. Um, the purpose of this was looking where they infested first. And the takeaway of this pretty complex graph is that like to infest on the field edge close to trees. Um, that's the way. Close to the trees. The distance from edge at the very bottom of these graphs here is 0, 5, 10, 20, 40, 60 meters. And 0 to 10 has some pretty significant infestation by the trees. The left two graphs is without trees, and infestations are pretty flat across the board. Another thing Robert looked at, or his fur in 24, is chemical management. So they used pots they had because they looked at average adults, and you can't capture salt in the field, at least not easy. The takeaway is what they looked at, kind of like what we do with Dectes and Gall Midge, is they looked at the best time to treat this tentiform leaf miner. And in this case, they use the untreated control, your agrimec, and your indigo, your two insecticides. And then if you keep in mind that the slide I showed earlier, you have your serpentine, so your earlier instar leaf miner, the blotch stage, and then tentiform is when they're, the fourth and fifth instar, and the takeaway is Agrimec and Indigo both had highly significant control of your serpentine and blotch stage of instar, so those earlier instars. Once they reach the tentiform stage, their last stage of the larva and the pupa, there was no control. As you can see, that they're all non-significant. So if you do think you have, leaf miner, just give us a call. And there are ways to control them. You just have to be early, apparently. So a summary, they are widespread in soybean. You can see all the different, there's Quebec, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri. South Dakota, we only found them 1 year, but we will, keep monitoring for them. Within field distribution, it appears they always infest the edge of a field and right next to trees. Seems to be the where you should keep an eye out for them. Chemical controls, insecticides appear to be effective against those early instars. And then their host range, likely limited to soybean and then those two native hosts I talked about earlier. So again, they're here. We're looking for them. If you do see damage as like the pictures I've shown, please contact us. We'd be very interested to come look at it. All right. I have three more insects to cover. We'll go through them quick. They are defoliators, as you saw on the intro slide. The first one is grasshoppers. As I'm sure all of you are aware, they've been a pretty big issue in South Dakota, mainly because of drought. They seem to like those drier conditions, and they can lead to pretty severe forage loss. So this is the most extreme version or example we have. In one of our research plots. This was in summer 2020, south of Blunt, South Dakota, so about 30 miles east of Pierre. But this was going to be one of our foliar trials for a sunflower pest, red sunflower seed weevil. We didn't get to conduct it. As I'm sure you're all aware, sunflowers should have giant green leaves. But grasshoppers came in and they ate absolutely everything. This is about 3 acres of sunflower, and they ate everything. Even ate chunks of the head of the sunflower. Here's another example in 2023, somewhere in southeast South Dakota. You can see they went after that corn ear and the leaves. I believe there's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's 9 grasshoppers. That is above threshold, as I'll show. So, what do we think for 2026? Well, most likely they're going to be a problem again, as they have been in the past years. A good indication of severity of grasshoppers is the frost in the fall. If we have a really late frost, there's a great chance that overwintering grasshoppers will survive that first frost. We won't get any deaths of overwintering grasshoppers from that frost. And unfortunately for this year, we had a very late frost in South Dakota. So South Dakota's right in the middle there. Light green, that's October 21 to 31st. That's how late it was this year. November 1 through 10th is that dark yellow. Um, Basically what that means is we probably had a lot of survival of grasshoppers. So, it's important this year, just like with every insect we've covered, to go out and scout your fields. For grasshoppers, since they go after literally everything, not just soybean, they'll eat tree bark if they have to. General threshold, is 30 to 45 nymphs per square yard, or 8 to 14 adults per square yard. You can also use a sweep net to determine this. Do 10 sweep nets and count for that same threshold. Um, Soybean in general, though, does have a defoliation threshold. It's 30% defoliation prior to flowering, and you might think 30% isn't a lot, but if you look at the picture there on the right, it looks way worse than it is, right? That or 20% defoliation after flowering. Reach either of those with grasshoppers or any deflator. You want to think about chemical management. So we have done some past research on grasshoppers using the sweep nets and 4D pendulum swings. And the whole point of this project that we did, I believe in 17 and 18, was just to look at the species composition and the distribution of grasshoppers. And I like to show this map because it took us a lot of work to do, but also if you see the dark red circles, that's threshold. That's 8 or more grasshoppers using that sweep net. And the takeaway for this, though, is the distribution of it, right? 2018 reached thresholds in different counties than 2017 did. And we show this because with pests, especially with insects, you have to go out in your field to monitor, to scout, to look for what's in your field because it could differ year to year, and it always does. Next defoliator is bean leaf beetles. They're small beetles with 4 spots on the body. You can see here's 3 pictures, A, B, C. Those are all bean leaf beetles. They just have varying their coloration. Um, and they can cause severe defoliation. They did wipe out one of our spray trials, I believe, in 2017. It was early season soybean. They clear cut it basically. And then another pest is Japanese beetles. This was taken on August 26, 2023. We were actually looking for gall midge at this point. Uh, but they are pretty severe defoliator in Upcount or other states further southwest. In South Dakota, they're not an issue as of yet, but it is kind of like with the tentiform leaf miner, something to keep an eye out for. So you can see a picture here. They basically eat that entire leaf and put splotches throughout. You can see the beetle there. If you've ever seen them, they're bright green, metallic green with kind of a black or sorry, brown back. So uh, those defoliators, the threshold combines all of them, right? So as I mentioned earlier, 30% before or prior to flowering and 20% after flowering. So with that, here's some slides. Here's some contact information. If you do see, the tentiform leaf miner or any of these insects, please give us a call because we're always interested to get more samples and to just where they're at, where the problems are. So you can email me or give me a call. Just like with Adam, stop by my office as well. Either of us would be happy to answer your questions. Pat as well. He's an entomologist by training and profession as well. So thank you.
All right, thanks, Phil. Yeah, and that was good info about that tentiform leaf miner. And even though, I mean, you showed on there that was 2025, they were just on the south side of the Missouri there in the southeast corner of the state. So I think if you're probably in the Yankton or Vermilion area, probably a good idea to keep an eye out for those. Wouldn't be surprised if they're
Mhm.
in the area already. We just haven't detected them yet. So we do have a couple questions here. I know we're a little bit over, but you got time to hang with us. There's a poll that is up now, so you can go ahead and fill that out, and we'll address these couple questions here in the Q&A. So the first one here is for Adam. This is regarding the Dectes stem borer. Have you tried an air blast sprayer for Dectes applications?
We have not, and one of the reasons we probably wouldn't try that is because we knock them off the plant doesn't mean they're not going to once we go by and they settle and come, regain their senses after getting knocked down violently. They'll probably come back, and because they're active for so long, and the adults can feed and can stay active. Um, that would be kind of a quick knockdown and but not remove the population. And so I don't know if we could try it and see how bad it disrupts them. But I think the big thing we need to do with the Dectes, since the populations are so large, is try to knock the population down a little bit here going forward. There's another question I believe possibly related to Dectes as well. And seed treatments haven't had any impact on the Dectes. They also, from the research, if this was to the soybean gall midge, we haven't seen any benefit of seed treatment for the soybean gall midge either. One of the issues is that those seed treatments, although active during the time point when these two pests are infesting, it just doesn't seem like from our research that they're in the right spot of the plant to really have that impact. Uh, and so we don't see a lot of knockdown from seed treatments on either of those pests. The last question, I can answer this as well. In the gall midge life cycle, do they go from third instar to adult, and do they pupate? What is the seasonal timing that they emerge as adults? So Phil kind of covered. I'll start with the seasonal timing of emergence. It's sometime in May and June. And South Dakota, we have some variability just due to the weather. They are down in the soil, so they hang out down in the soil as larvae. They spin silken cocoons around themselves. They pupate in the spring. before the big adult emergence, and then they start coming out. And what we think is that they're very hardy because it seems like they do just fine here in South Dakota, and North Dakota's found them in the last couple of years too. So definitely a pretty hardy insect. As far as the life cycle in season, uh, and Nebraska's worked in Minnesota on this a little bit more than we have, but they've observed that you can have more than one generation per year. And so essentially they'll march into the field, and as they march in towards the center, every so often you get a new life cycle. So I don't have the exact number for how many generations within a season they have, but that is possible. And so they still go down into the soil. They essentially jump out of the plants when they're ready, and then they go down into the soil and they pupate and then they emerge again. So, and if you have any very specific questions related to soybean gall midge, I highly recommend that you reach out to Justin McMecken down at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He's worked on this pest for as long as we have, but he's focused in on it a little bit more. We are still covering quite a few different crops and pests, so we're working on it, but he's definitely been able to do a lot more than we have in the last few years. So thanks for those questions.
Yeah, thank you guys. Yep, thanks Adam for covering that. So that wraps it up for today. I just wanted to remind everyone that you can access the recordings for these webinars on our SDSU Extension YouTube page. There should be a link there for that in the chat, along with some of that information for getting the CCA credits. So with that, thanks everybody for joining us. I invite everybody to tune in tomorrow. We'll be talking about sunflowers and some forage pests. And then on Thursday, we'll be focusing on corn. So with that, thanks again. Thanks to our speakers, and we'll hopefully see you tomorrow.